All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name's Samantha Kulish-Fargione. I am the Executive Director of the Weston Historical Society in Weston, Connecticut. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this evening's presentation, Stories of Connecticut Architecture, with guest presenter Christopher Wigren. Before we begin, just a few important reminders. Like I had mentioned before, we're going to keep our microphones muted as well as our cameras turned off for this evening's presentation. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the program, and we'll be using the chat box. I see that people are using it, so everyone should know where it is now. If you're just joining in, the chat box is at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a speech bubble, so you can click on that and it allows you to type in a question. I'll be moderating the Q&A at the end. I'll be reading out the questions to Christopher. And like I had mentioned, we are going to be recording this. We are currently recording it to make it available on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube channel. Now, our next virtual lecture is Whaleboat Wars on Long Island Sound during the American Revolution. That's with guest presenter Ed Hines, and that's coming up on Wednesday, October 14th at 6:30, and we'll begin registration for that next week. And we also have some in-person outdoor events that we are working on for October. So if you live in the area, we'd love for you to join us at a live event on our property. And if you would like to help us continue with our community programming, please consider making a donation to the Weston Historical Society at the end of the lecture. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and you can visit our website, westonhistoricalsociety.org, to donate or to become a member. So I'm going to shortly turn it over to Christopher Wigren, but I just wanted to give you a little background on Christopher. He is an architectural historian, and he is also the Deputy Director of Preservation Connecticut. His articles and essays have appeared in the Hartford Courant, the New Haven Register, and Connecticut Explored magazine. His book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places, can be ordered through HFS Books. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Christopher Wigren.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Let's see if I can figure this out. There we go. We've got our slides. Instead, I'm here to talk about this book, which I wrote. You'll notice one bit of confusion right at the beginning. If you look at the book cover, it says Christopher Wigren, Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. And the logo on the upper right says Preservation Connecticut. The organization has changed its name somewhere between the publication of the book and now. And that's something that's going to confuse archivists for decades to come, I'm sure. This book was written to provide an introduction to the architecture of the state through stories about 100 selected places. It includes non-building works such as landscapes, town and cityscapes, bridges, dams, and other structures, because to me, those are architecture as well. My definition of architecture is making places, shaping the physical world around us to accommodate the activities of our lives, whether it's work, play, living, worshiping, recreation, caring for each other or others. So it's not a best of book. It includes a mixture of well-known favorites, sometimes discussed from different vantage points, and interesting unknown or little known places. The point is, first of all, just to show the variety and richness of Connecticut's architectural heritage. Very often people think of architecture in Connecticut, they think of colonial houses. But we've got much, much more than that to celebrate and enjoy. It's also written to make the case for preserving and reusing some of these places, which is the goal of Preservation Connecticut. And finally, just to get you started, to get readers out to look for themselves. So tonight I'm going to share a few of the 100 places that are covered in the book. Because of the pandemic, I thought I'd do what many of us are doing these days and stepping outdoors. So I'm focusing on landscapes, outdoor places that we can visit more safely, but that are places that people have shaped to carry out their lives in Connecticut. And that'll also give us an opportunity to think perhaps about another issue facing the world, which is our relationship to the natural order around us. So, shaping the landscape. All architecture begins with the land. Historically, the shape of the land determined where people settled, how they made their living, what materials they had to build with. In Connecticut, the fertile soils and open meadows of the Connecticut River Valley supported farming, while the swift-flowing streams of the Quinebaug, Shetucket, and Naugatuck-Housatonic river systems powered mills and factories. Cities grew up on harbors or rivers at points where navigation was promising, and agricultural towns on hilltops were built away from the dangers of flooding or from what settlers believed was unhealthy lowland air. At the same time, the people of Connecticut haven't merely built on the land, they've altered the land itself to meet their needs and desires, to ease their work or to give pleasure. They've divided it into fields and towns, dammed streams and rivers, excavated hillsides, filled valleys, created parks and gardens, all asserting, for better or worse, their mastery over the environment. But nature has ways of reasserting itself. We start with the very first builders, the Mohegans of Montville. The common image of Native American building in the Northeast is of temporary structures. English colonists recorded wigwams as ephemeral structures built of bent saplings and covered with bark. The environmental historian William Cronin has shown that Native peoples also shaped the landscape more broadly. They cleared fields for crops, managed woodlands to attract game, and built weirs to catch fish. Some of the rock piles and stone cellars hidden in Connecticut forests are believed to be Indian construction. So how can we find traces of these first builders today? The Mohegan Congregational Church, sitting atop Mohegan Hill in Uncasville, part of the town of Montville, is one starting point. The church was established in 1831, at a time when the federal government was forcing Indians off of their ancestral lands. Building a Christian church demonstrated that the Mohegans had been, quote unquote, civilized and posed no threat to their neighbors. The strategy worked. They were able to stay. Eventually, though, the Mohegan Reservation was broken up, after which the church was the only property still owned by the tribe. The site for the church had been chosen for specific, significant reasons. Mohegan Hill had been important to the tribe long before 1831. All around the church are features important to the Mohegans, including Moshup's Rock, which has an indentation identified as a giant's footprint, or other formations where the little people lived, and Uncas's Spring, associated with the leader of the Mohegans in their split from the Pequot tribe. In the 1860s, with the reservation gone, Mohegan Hill became the site of the Mohegans' annual Wigwam Festival, an event revived to cement tribal identity. The festival is a thanksgiving for the harvest and an expression of hospitality to the Mohegans' neighbors. Tribal members built a large brush arbor known as the wigwam, in which to serve food and display crafts. Since 2003, the festival has been moved to another site, but Mohegan Hill remains a central focus for tribal life, a place that is remembered, visited, celebrated, and sometimes reinterpreted. But although the Mohegans have constructed buildings on the hill, like the church, its significance is rooted in an earlier non-European concept of place that arises not from what people do to the land, but rather from discovering the significance inherent in its natural features. The identification and continued use of places like Mohegan Hill are among the ways in which Native Americans shaped their environment. And this should be considered Connecticut's first architecture. The arrival of the settlers, European settlers, the shape of the land was seen in very different ways and developed into landscapes for farming. Blessed with some of the most fertile soil in New England, the Connecticut River Valley developed into a flourishing agricultural region by the 18th century. Prosperous farming towns lined the river from Connecticut through Massachusetts and into Vermont and New Hampshire. One piece of this world survives in South Windsor, where Main Street, the old Riverside Road, has been bypassed by modern-day Route 5, leaving an historic landscape nearly 5 miles long. South Windsor was settled by inhabitants of Windsor on the other bank of the Connecticut River in the late 17th century. The southern part of the Main Street corridor eventually became known as Windsor Farms. To the north, a separate community grew up called East Windsor Hill, based at a ferry landing where merchants shipped agricultural products to New York and the West Indies, and it received imported goods to sell to their neighbors. Some of these merchants made fortunes and built splendid mansions. Windsor Farms didn't produce mansion-level wealth until much later, when tobacco became an important agricultural product. Impressive as they are, the great houses are only part of a bigger picture. Also of note are the rows of trees that line the street, the barns and outbuildings, and especially the tobacco sheds, the warehouses and stores, workers' homes, and boarding houses. Today, suburban infill is on the increase, but for the moment, it remains largely unobtrusive. Most important to note is the land itself. It steps up and back from the river in a series of terraces. The first level is alluvial plain, often flooded, and so containing fertile sediment and devoted almost entirely to cropland, now as it has been for more than 300 years. A steep bank leads to a second tier where the street runs, safe from flooding. And this is where most of the buildings are concentrated. Beyond them are more fields, and then another rise up to the level of Route 5. This topography determined the shape of the settlement. The inhabitants divided the land into narrow strips running eastward from the river, giving each property owner a bit of each type of land: fields for crops, a home lot along the street, pasture and woodland farther in. The pattern is still visible from the air in the parallel field divisions and roads that run back from the river. Can you see it here? Those parallel lines running across. Predating any surviving structures, this landscape still provides the framework that shapes South Windsor's present-day life and development. It's a living inheritance from colonial days. Early settlements often included a public landscape as well, many of which are what we now know as the New England Town Green. New Haven's is one of the most imposing. New Haven's founders created one of the most enduring images of American city planning, a perfect square divided into 9 smaller squares, with the center one reserved for open space. There's a trapezoidal 10th block it reached towards the harbor, you see on the lower left there. No one really knows who conceived this plan or what it means. Writers have pointed to sources that range from the ancient Roman architect, Vitruvius, to the biblical prophet Ezekiel's description of heaven, and to precedents from Puritan theology to English settlements in Ireland. What is certain is that New Haven belongs to a tradition of rational, rectilinear plans that extends from ancient Greece to the American courthouse square. In 17th century Connecticut, this tradition also shaped the layouts of Fairfield, Saybrook, and Guilford, among others. But New Haven stands out as the most ambitiously scaled, the most precisely executed, and today the best preserved of its period. Whether or not this plan is unique, it is truly a classic of American town planning. The New Haven Green as it appears today owes much to a later generation. In the beginning, it was a utilitarian space that served many public needs, from market to drill field to burying ground. The meeting house stood more or less at the center, the little square in the middle of the block there. And over the years, the inhabitants of New Haven added or removed as needed other buildings and facilities, schools, state houses, a whipping post, a town pump. The federal era in the early 19th century brought a concerted program of improvements that included planting elm trees, erecting a fence, closing the burying ground and removing most of the gravestones, and tearing down extraneous buildings. A major element of this improvement program was the construction of 3 imposing and fashionable new churches, all at the same time. Looking at them, one cannot help but conclude that their design was coordinated as a unified statement of New Haven's prosperity, taste, and civic virtue. In the middle is Center Church, with its portico, lofty spire, and bold ornament, dominating the scene. The other 2 are more deferential, but each distinguished in its own way. United Church on the right by its more delicate elegance, and Trinity Episcopal Church on the left by its groundbreaking Gothic Revival design and the rich color of its trap rock walls. As with the town plan, the records frustratingly refuse to identify the minds behind this coordination. Since about 1820, the Green's overall character has remained remarkably constant, and it has achieved iconic status. With a simple palette of grass, trees, fence, and paths, it can accommodate a wide variety of activities, while continuing to serve its most important function as a visible symbol of New Haven, the physical and emotional heart of the city. You see, it's a place for concerts, which are, not just entertainment, but in a sense, community building activities. And on the right, the Occupy New Haven protesters from 2012, who used this public space to begin a discussion about civic virtues, civic ways of organizing the country in the early 21st century. In addition to public spaces, we have private landscapes, gardens, estates. The summer home, one of them is the summer home of Edward Harkness and his wife Mary, called Eolia. This was one of the grandest estates built on the Connecticut shore between the Civil War and World War I. The mansion, surrounded by elaborate gardens, sits on 235 acres, now a state park. Although the buildings are impressive, the real reason to see Eolia is its landscape. Park-like grounds surround the house, and the original entry drive winds through stone-walled fields, orchards, and pastures dotted with barns, greenhouses, stables, and other estate buildings. Eolia was not only a summer retreat, but also a working farm that supplied food for the Harknesses both when they were in residence here and also at their home in New York City. At the heart of the landscape are the gardens, which Mary Harkness supervised herself. The original garden plan was by a Boston landscape firm, symmetrical and heavily reliant on architectural features such as walls and pergolas. Plantings were equally formal, consisting of rows of annuals in bright colors. After 1919, Mary Harkness turned to Beatrix Farrand to redesign the gardens. Farrand was one of the women who broke into landscape architecture by designing gardens for the wealthy. Her first work at Eolia was the Asian-inspired East Garden, intended to display statuary that the Harknesses collected on their travels. That's what you're seeing here. In the West Garden, which was older, she replaced the rigid rows of annuals with drifts of perennials in softer colors. The use of billowing informal plantings in a formal geometric framework is typical of Farrand's work. This can be traced back to the influential English garden designer, Gertrude Jekyll. Farrand also added a naturalistic rock garden as well as a secluded box parterre. Since Eolia was a summer home, Farrand didn't have to worry about what the gardens would look like in the off-season. But a view from the air or a winter visit reveal that the landscape is built on a definite structure, a skeleton, if you will. Without the mitigating softness of the plantings, one can easily perceive the formality of the layout. This is the West Garden that you're seeing. The garden is divided into room-like spaces with different characters, but tied together by axial views. Note the transitions from one space to another, marked by gates or steps. Experience the contrast between the sheltered parterre, that's that geometric square in the lower right, and the sunny, exposed rock garden immediately to the right of it, which is open to the ocean breezes. This underlying structure, apart from the plantings, is what gives this garden its strength as a place. Returning to the public realm, we look at landscape designs for institutions. 19th century Romantic thought believed strongly in the restorative qualities of nature. As Frederick Law Olmsted, the Hartford-born pioneer of American landscape architecture, wrote, "The enjoyment of scenery employs the mind without fatigue, and yet exercises it, tranquilizes it, and yet enlivens it, and thus gives the effect of refreshing rest and reinvigoration for the whole system." This belief lay behind the development of urban parks in the 19th century. New York's Central Park by Olmsted and Calvert Vaux is perhaps the best known example, although Hartford began Bushnell Park slightly before. Hartford also boasts a more direct example of landscape design for refreshment and reinvigoration. In 1824, one of the country's first mental hospitals, the Connecticut Retreat for the Insane, opened here on the city's outskirts. In 1860, the retreat's superintendent, John S. Butler, decided to improve the grounds, which he considered rough and wet and, quote, of little use. He envisioned a setting that would contribute to the treatment of the hospital's patients. He recalled it a therapeutic Arcadia. Butler commissioned a landscape design from Olmsted and Vaux, but with the outbreak of the Civil War, Olmsted left to run the United States Sanitary Commission. And the job was given over to Jacob Weidenman to finalize and execute the plan. Weidenman had come originally from Switzerland, where he was trained in architecture, engineering, and horticulture. And at the same time as his work at the retreat, he was overseeing the construction of Bushnell Park. Though it's smaller, the retreat landscape resembles those of Central and Bushnell parks. Around the edges of the property, dense plantings were created a buffer against the city. Inside this were rolling lawns dotted with trees, either in clumps or as single specimens. Grading and drainage improvements solved the wetness problem, forming a base for winding paths and roads. There was a flower garden and an activities building called the museum, which could be used for therapy. In 1868, Vaux and his partner, Frederick Clark Withers, expanded and remodeled the retreat building, giving it a picturesque outline in harmony with the landscape. Over the years since then, the retreat, which is now called the Institute of Living, has grown. New buildings and parking lots have replaced much of that outer buffer. But the central area remains largely unchanged, with its lawns, curved paths, and naturalistic clumps of trees and shrubs. Some of the specimens trees survive from Weidemann's day. In Butler's vision, this landscape served a broader audience, not just the patients of the retreat. From the first, he opened the grounds to the public to demonstrate, as he wrote, that the externals of a lunatic asylum need not be repulsive, and that its inner life is not without its cheerful, home-like aspects. The Institute of Living still continues this tradition, offering this peaceful, verdant setting to patients and the public alike for what Olmsted called refreshing rest and reinvigoration of the whole system. The mention of parks, Central Park and Bushnell Park, reminds us that landscapes can be designed for entertainment as well. So here's a very different kind of landscape design, Lime Rock Park in Salisbury. As soon as automobiles were invented, drivers began racing them. As with horses, some raced on enclosed oval tracks, while others preferred open country roads with their more challenging configurations and better scenery. By the 1950s, the dangers of this latter practice led to the development of tracks designed to evoke the experience of open road racing, but in a controlled environment. One of the first of these was built at Lime Rock, a rural village in northwestern Connecticut, where sports car enthusiast Jim Vail had taken to driving in a gravel pit. Deciding to build a proper track, Vail enlisted John Fitch, a race car driver who had witnessed terrible crashes and was committed to making racing safer. Fitch, in turn, brought in engineers from the Cornell Aeronautical Engineering Laboratory to review the layout and recommend safety improvements to protect both drivers and spectators. The lab's director, Bill Milliken, was a racing fan, which may explain why they took on the job. The resulting racetrack is 1.5 miles long and has 7 curves in varying shapes to test the skill of the drivers. The design takes into account the engineer's recommendations for curvature, banking, and elevation. They also called for recovery and deceleration lanes, so drivers could regain control or slow down to avoid serious injury to drivers or damage to cars. Barriers were designed to stop cars safely, to be portable and replaceable, and to allow emergency access to disabled vehicles. Along with its safety features, the landscape is an important part of Lime Rock Park. Unlike other racetracks, it has no grandstands. Instead, spectators sit on grassy slopes dotted with trees. There are views to a church steeple in the village, and beyond that, to rolling hills in the distance. The park-like setting makes going to the races an informal, festive event. There is space to arrange picnic blankets and chairs in the shade or in the sun. Children can sleep or play while grown-ups watch the races. Spectators can easily move about to watch the action from different vantage points. Much thought went into making Lime Rock Park. In addition to engineering the racetrack to balance safety with thrills, all the practical needs of drainage, screening, parking, and crowd control had to be satisfied. Most important was integrating the practical necessities with the beauty of the natural surroundings to create an inviting setting for the fun of watching the races. The crowds that flocked to Lime Rock on summer afternoons attest to the success of its creators. In the 20th century, the sheer size and extent of landscape alterations grew enormously. New technologies made it possible to reshape the environment on an unprecedented scale. Road building filled valleys and cut through mountains. Reclamation projects turned wetlands into dry ground. Irrigation transformed deserts into lush suburban lawns. Mighty rivers were dammed to create reservoirs to satisfy ever-increasing demand for water or electricity. Beginning about 1900, the Connecticut Light and Power Company constructed a system of reservoirs and power plants to provide electricity to Connecticut cities. The Housatonic River offered potential for power generation, but seasonal fluctuations made it an unreliable resource. To address this problem, CL&P built the first major pumped storage hydroelectric facility in the United States. Beginning in 1926, the company constructed a dam 100 feet high and 952 feet long to block the Rocky River, a tributary of the Housatonic, and create Candlewood Lake. When the river is high, water is pumped up 200 feet to the lake. When the river is low or demand for electricity is high, the water is released from the lake and runs back down to turn turbines and generate power. Pumping the water up actually uses more power than is produced on the return trip. But ensuring a reliable supply when water is low was worth the investment. The powerhouse is a lofty brick structure, tall enough so that the turbines can be lifted out of their housings for servicing. Full-length steel sash windows emphasize the building's height and provide natural light for monitoring the machinery within. Across the road, the penstock, that giant tube, 15 feet in diameter, carries water up the hillside to the lake, or allows it to flow back again to the power plant when needed. There's a 76-foot vertical standpipe to provide escape in case of water surges. Behind the dam, Candlewood Lake flooded more than 8 square miles. It's 11 miles long and has more than 60 miles of shoreline. There's several villages, countless houses and farms underneath the waters. The building of this lake was changed on a massive scale. In essence, CL&P not only built an electric plant, it created an entirely new landscape that has attracted development in the form of vacation cottages and year-round homes. The lake also attracted a different mix of plants and animals and fish and birds, creating an ecosystem that in the decades that ensued achieved its own stability. It's natural, but not completely so, because it depends on that human-made dam. For no matter how solid that dam seems to be, it's also fragile. Without ongoing human intervention in the form of maintenance, the water behind the dam eventually will break through it or flow around it in its steady search to run downhill. It will flood the towns downstream, leave lakefront property high and dry, and wipe out the Candlewood ecosystem. It's a useful reminder that whatever people build, they build in opposition to the laws of nature. And in the end, nature will win out. I hope you'll find that this book is just a starting point, and that it will inspire you to learn more about Connecticut and its architecture, but more than that, to see and experience it for yourselves. Elizabeth Mills Brown, a local historian with whom I worked for many years, put it perfectly. Architecture is for everyone, she wrote, and there's enough to go around if we'll only learn to take care of it. We can't write it all down on convenient lists that we carry in our pockets, but it's all around you wherever you go. So go out, keep your eyes open, enjoy every bit of it, whether it's on somebody's list or not, and above all, guard it. So the book is Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. I welcome questions and comments after tonight. If you want to get in touch with me, there's my email address. In addition to the website that Samantha mentioned, you can also order it through Preservation Connecticut's website, preservationct.org. Thank you very much. Now let's see what kind of questions we've got.
Thank you so much, Christopher. I thought it was very interesting that you sort of brought to our attention that architecture doesn't mean a building, that it can mean so many different things, to landscape architecture, to how architecture sort of influences nature and vice versa. So thank you so much. And I appreciate you showing us locations that we can visit. The churches, the New Haven Green, the park, even Candlewood Lake. And those people that are out of town, hopefully once the pandemic is over, please come to Connecticut to visit these exciting places.
So anytime, explore your own places.
Exactly. So let's see if anyone has a question. Wrangler asked, can we get the email address again that you had put up there?
Sure. It's, there we go, cwigren@preservationct.org.
Okay, so anyone who wants to see that email address, we'll leave it up for a little bit so you can see that. And if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to use the chat box. And someone said it was brilliant and a refreshing architectural tour of Connecticut. And they very much appreciate you coming on tonight and speaking. So thank you. Now, if people are interested in the specifics of the architecture of many of these places that you showed us this evening, is that in your book? Are sort of the specifics of the style and who built them? Is all of that information in there?
To some degree. I mean, you're hearing pretty much the text of the way I write about things. Each of the 100 places does include a little box at the end with the name and address and date of construction, designers, architects, builders, and usually some additional suggestions for additional reading.
Excellent. We have a question. Does your book touch on urban spaces, or is it mostly landscape design and specific architecture?
It does include some urban design. The New Haven Green discussion sort of verged into that. I talk about a couple other big cities. I talk about a condominium development. I talk about some developments of worker housing that were built by the government during World War I, when industry was booming to supply the war needs and there was shortage of housing. So the federal government got in the housing business. I've got the suburban neighborhoods, so a lot of urban design kinds of entries as well.
Excellent. So, you know, a lot of times when we think of Connecticut architecture, like you said earlier, we're thinking of that colonial era, though it sounds like your book spans a much broader time period, bringing it into the modern era.
Yeah, it goes from as I say, from the Mohegans, the ancient prehistoric living in the landscape. I think the most recent building was completed in 2006.
Interesting. Thank you. Jay has a question. Jay asks, do you have a particular favorite Connecticut building or landscape architecture?
It's the last one I looked at. You know, it really, I just keep finding new things to get interested in. I certainly feel that everything in here is interesting. In the process of writing the book, I really developed a greater interest in landscape design. So that's what I've been thinking a lot about since the book was completed. And since Frederick Law Olmsted's 200th birthday is coming up in just two years. You know, it's some of the stories behind these places really are fascinating and give what even can be very sort of ordinary humdrum looking places. You look at them differently once you sort of find out some of the things that went into creating them.
Excellent. William has a question. Do you note how the rugged topography and impassable wilderness just north of the coast factor into the design evolution of public locations and spaces?
A little bit. I mean, certainly settlement followed the easiest routes. To the present day, it's easier to travel north and south in Connecticut than it is to go east and west. Sometimes, very often, connections will be made, or as people move from one place to another, they follow those easy lines. And even in the 20th century, that affected the building of the Merritt Parkway through Fairfield County, which is cutting across all those rivers and streams, and posed real problems for the engineers building it, and it was criticized by some people for being too much like a roller coaster, up and down and up and down and up and down.
And Christina has a question. Christina asks, if we want to learn more about the architecture in our town, where should we start?
Start with your public library or your historical society. In addition to books and things that they might have in their collections, the State Preservation Office does a series of surveys. They send consultants out, historians, architects, to look around the community, see what seems to be historic, find out the interesting architecture, the sites where historic events took place, and make a record of them. And most of those surveys certainly are collected at the State Preservation Office, but usually a copy is given to the local library or the local historical society as well. They're not always the easiest reading, but if you really want to dig stuff that's not written about in a lot of places, that's a good place to look. I used a lot of those. I also used the National Register of Historic Places, which is a federal program documenting historic places of all kinds around the country. But a lot of that is available online, and you can read the nominations. Again, there's a fair amount of bureaucratic stuff to wade through, but an awful lot of fascinating information as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christopher. And I don't see any more questions right now, so I am just going to just give it one more second to see if we have any more questions. And I don't see any. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And Edwin says thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. And I hope that everyone will go out and purchase your book and learn more about Connecticut architecture, even those who don't live in our state. It's definitely an interesting place with interesting stories. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you for supporting the Weston Historical Society. And if you've donated in the past, thank you so much. And we hope that you will join us again in October for Whaleboat Wars of Long Island Sound. So thank you. And Christopher, we wish you a lot of luck, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it very much.
Excellent. Our pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. And we will be emailing everyone a copy, a recording of this lecture sometime tomorrow or Friday. So be on the lookout in your email for a recording of the lecture. Thank you so much. Have a good night. And I'm going to end the meeting now.